have a theory issue to bring up.
Excellent.
I'm having a little trouble conceptualizing states, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that a
Sure.
little bit.
Sure. It's very interesting we have of the sort of many different components that the human psyche has. Two have just increasingly kind of come to the fore. And in retrospect, we can see that virtually the entire human potential movement almost divided in terms of whether they gave emphasis to one or the other. And one is states of consciousness, and one is stages of consciousness. And at first they sort of seem kind of similar, but they really, the more you look into them, they're really quite different in certain ways. Stages show a development. They tend to have a sequential unfolding. And that's sort of how you get to be a stage, sort of one follows after the other. There are stages in nature, there are states in nature as well, you can mention some of those. But a classic stage is, for example, atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. And a real stage sequence is invariant, it's irreversible, or at least it goes in one direction only. You don't have molecules before atoms. And it's just, we know of no case where that's so. And even in simplified stage-like conceptions, letters to words, to sentences to paragraphs, again, you can't go from letters to sentences and skip words. And we know of no exceptions to that. So in the human psyche, there are stages, there are components that do unfold like that. Phonemes, the thing I was just mentioning, classic example, and no real known exceptions to those. So stage conceptions have also been investigated by a lot of Western developmental psychologists. And well-known names there are Piaget and Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan and Claire Graves and Abe Maslow and Robert Keegan and Jenny Wade and so on. And that's a very important component of the psyche. It's not the whole component, but it's very important. And it really, we find that it helps enormously in ways I'll come back to when you're attempting to see how people interpret state experiences they have, or peak experiences they have. So I mentioned stages first just to give a little contrast to, can help sort of understand states by seeing what stages are. States of consciousness don't tend to show development. They tend to just sort of come, they stay a bit, and they go. You can have a waking state, dream state, deep sleep state. Those are natural states that all human beings have. But you don't think of the dream state as showing development. It's just you have a dream, next night you have a dream, next night you have a dream. In nature, weather states, for example, if there's a weather storm coming in, that's a state. But it usually doesn't show stages. It doesn't develop into another thing, into another thing. So, now, states can have kind of a little bit of phases, sort of introductory phase and so on. But stage sequential unfolding, not usually. So states, and people have analyzed states into various different types. There's sort of broad states like waking, dreaming, deep sleep. Those are sort of the natural states. I like to include, at the very least, ever-present non-dual as a state that you can recognize, although it can also be a permanent condition. And those are the natural states, at least some of them. There are also unnatural states, although that sounds, can have a bad connotation. Non-ordinary states, states that you have to cultivate. These can include meditative states. It can be psychedelic states or states due to ingested substances. A drunken state, an intoxicated state. So again, they don't tend to show development. States can also be just phenomenal states. I have a state of excitement, a state of depression, and a state of so on. All of those have that in common. They don't tend to show development. They tend to come, stay a while, they tend to go. Now they can be very profound. Meditative states and some of the peak experiences, altered states, all very profound. The humanistic and transpersonal school of psychology over the past really 20 or 30 years tended to divide into two camps. One of them emphasized stages, and they tended to be people that were involved in usually some form of meditative practice, but there's kind of a steady, progressive unfolding. And those, they tended to be very comfortable with stages. They also had studied the work of Jane Lovinger or Kohlberg or Carol Gilligan or Claire Graves and knew that the research behind that was pretty strong. These are things we had really, it was important to take into account. And then the other camp very much emphasized altered states. And they weren't into meditation so much, they were into drugs. So, not bad, but these people were sucking down a lot of, mushrooms and psilocybin and, that kind of thing. And so for them, states was really important, and they were very distrustful of stages. They didn't like the notion. The stages seemed to hem them in. Stages like, no, I can go straight to perfect realization, and it's going to stick. Now, not just getting a recognition of ever-present states like Big Mind and Big Heart, but how can you make that a permanent realization and not just a realization you have as somewhat temporary? So we had these two real divisions that went on for a very long time, and only a handful of people from the beginning were emphasizing the importance of both. So let me pause there and see if that clarifies states a bit, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we think they relate to each other.
So are the states you talked about, like a state of intoxication or some sort of emotional state or flow state, are those subsets of the other larger 4 categories? Or are they sort of something else? Are they like subsets of a subtle state?
The way it appears is, yes, there are broad states of consciousness. And then within those broad states, like waking dream, deep sleep, or non-dual, then there are phenomenal or smaller states. And those tend to occur within these larger states. Is that?
Mm-hmm. So would a state, like an emotional state, would it have a manifestation in, say, in a gross state and in a subtle state and potentially causal as well?
What was the first part? An emotional state?
Like an emotional state. Would it have a gross manifestation, a subtle manifestation?
It can. It can. It just depends on where it starts and how long you follow it. So you can start with an emotional, and this is one of the great things that Tantra does, which will start with a gross emotional state. It could be a negative, very strong negative state, or positive. But if you stay with that gross emotional state, with awareness, it'll tend to unfold into a subtler form, to a subtler state. And if you stay with that, it can indeed go into causal. And most people have a little hard time doing that, but that's what spiritual practice can help you do. But it's a wonderful fertile ground of taking everything and bringing it to the path. So whatever the state that comes up, you can work with it, and it will ultimately reveal its non-dual wisdom. Okay.
So can it actually exist
Sure.
in gross, subtle, and causal simultaneously?
Can you?
I mean, does that state actually exist simultaneously in all of those, or is
We
that?
probably wouldn't say simultaneously, because what happens by the time you take the gross form of it and then let it unfold into the subtle form, then the gross form tends to drop away. And then you're more in touch with that subtle form. And if you stay with that, with awareness, then it can give way to its causal, non-dual form.
Thank you.
Okay, and let me briefly mention what we found, and this is, we call it the Wilbur Combs matrix, because Alan Combs and I sort of stumbled upon this simultaneously, is that if you take any of the stage conceptions, like let's say spiral dynamics, and then let's say, so you can have, you're familiar with spiral dynamics a little bit? So you can have, I just use a few, red, blue, orange, green, and yellow. That's the stage you're at. That's sort of the predominant way that you tend to interpret reality. But at any of those stages, you can have a state experience. You can have a gross, subtle, causal, or non-dual state experience. But you will tend to interpret that state according to the stage you're at. And that's a very useful thing for us to find out, because it gives legitimacy to both sides of this equation. So it doesn't matter how, quote, lowly a stage you're at. You can be at red or blue or orange or green or yellow, and you can have a subtle or causal or non-dual experience, even a big mind. And it's a very authentic experience, even if you're only at red or blue or orange. So it's not to detract in any way from that authentic experience you're having, but it does suggest that if you want that to be more stable and to take in more perspectives, then you want to continue your growth and development through the stages. So I like that concept because it allows us, again, it allows any beginner at any stage to start experiencing meditative states. And then that will, and we have some pretty strong empirical evidence on this, the more you experience states like that, the quicker it helps you move through stages. And so I think, it's one of my favorite concepts, because a lot of people come in and they go, well, gee, if there's only these higher stages, you know, of coral or something higher, and I'm only at green, what am I going to do? Go, well, experience big mind, experience meditation, and it'll accelerate your growth through these stages. So it gives you a place to actually get grounded in ever-present, ultimate reality, and then let your stages unfold along the way. And I like that concept a lot, because it sort of allows us to, and this makes sense, it allows us to find ever-present spirit. It doesn't make sense, does it, that ever-present spirit would only pop into existence at the top of some sort of chain. I mean, it just doesn't intuitively feel right. So, but it does, but there are things to be said for evolving to higher stages, aren't there? Because you take more perspectives into account. If you look at the stage sequences going, just a real short version, from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric, well, you can be an ethnocentric and have an experience of big mind, but there's something to be said for growing into world-centric, isn't there? So that's what's nice about it, is it gives both sides of these an importance that does not detract from the other one, but says an integral approach is going to try to do both of those. But it does mean that any of us, no matter how lowly, can begin our experience of big mind, big heart, meditative states, and that will help us accelerate our growth through the stages, as will some of the other things that we do in integral transformative practice. So for some reason, that's a deeply satisfying concept. Does that make sense to y'all too? I just love that. And it stops this warfare between these two camps, because both of them have something incredibly important to say, but they just haven't gotten together very long.